Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of the Texas Hillstory podcast, the podcast about Texas history from a Texas history teacher's point of view. My name is Cam Hill. I teach 7th grade Texas history in Arlington, Texas. I'm a native Texan. I grew up in Cedar Hill, which is a small town about 17 miles south of downtown Dallas. When I was born, Cedar Hill had a population of approximately 2,000 people. This grew to about 7,000 when I graduated high school. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is I grew up in a small Texas town, and I still have a great love for any and all things with that small town, rural feel. And as you probably know, Texas is full of small towns with many great stories tied to Texas history. My goal with this podcast is to not only educate my students and the casual listeners on big picture concepts and historical knowledge, but to delve into some of the smaller, more intimate and interesting stories that just don't quite make it into our Texas history curriculum. Our first episode, though, is not one of these small town stories, but rather the story of a war that has come to be referred to as the Forgotten War. A war that resulted in the loss of nearly 40,000 military personnel on both sides, countless civilians, and it politically, financially, and you might even say emotionally crippled a country for years. On this episode, I'll be talking about the causes of the Mexican-American War, or as it's more commonly referred to here in the United States, the Mexican War. Interestingly enough, in Mexico, the war is called the American Intervention in Mexico. In the U.S., the war is viewed as the United States defending the newly acquired state of Texas from a Mexican invasion. In Mexico, however, the war is viewed as a land grab or a U.S. invasion of Mexican territory with the specific goal to steal land. The war lasted a little less than 2 years, between April 1846 and February 1848, and it would affect both the United States and Mexico in ways that are still being felt today. To understand the root causes of the war, you'd have to go back to 1844. James Polk was elected President of the United States, and during his campaign, Polk had promised to fulfill Manifest Destiny. Now, Manifest Destiny was the belief that it was America's God-given destiny to control all the lands between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And in 1845, Polk achieved part of this promise when the United States annexed Texas, and it became the 28th state in the Union. There was a bit of a problem with this, though. When General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was captured by Texas forces after the Battle of San Jacinto in April of 1836, he signed the Treaties of Velasco. Now, the Treaties of Velasco are what ended the Texas Revolution and what made Texas, for at least 9 years, an independent nation. According to the treaties, the border between Texas and Mexico was the Rio Grande. The Mexican government, however, never acknowledged this treaty since Santa Anna had been forced to sign it as a captive of the Texans. And instead, they insisted the actual border was approximately 150 miles farther north at the Nueces River. The disagreement between the two countries led to the area between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, known as the Nueces Strip, being considered a disputed territory, or a land that both sides claimed. The U.S. believed it belonged to them, and Mexico insisted it was their land. As a result, to avoid potential conflict, both countries' governments limited any activities and military presence in the Nueces Strip to avoid potential conflict, or, to put it more bluntly, to avoid war. Now, to further his campaign promise on expanding the United States, President Polk wanted California. California belonged to Mexico. Polk sent a diplomat to Mexico to negotiate the purchase of a bunch of Mexican territory, which would have included California, and he was prepared to offer up to $25 million for this land. But Mexico refused to even meet with the representative. To say this angered the Americans would be a bit of an understatement, but as it turned out, it played right into Polk's hands. In January of 1846, President Polk ordered the U.S. Army detachment based in Corpus Christi and led by future President of the United States, General Zachary Taylor, to march into the Nueces Strip and further still to the Rio Grande. As would be expected, the Mexican government viewed this as an invasion, and on April 25, 1846, a patrol of about 70 U.S. cavalry soldiers were ambushed by 2,000 Mexican soldiers who had themselves crossed the Rio Grande into the disputed territory. Now, as a result of the skirmish, 11 Americans were killed. Because communication over long distances was very slow in those days, it took a while for this information to get back to Washington. And on May 11th, 1846, President Polk addressed Congress and basically told them that American blood had been spilled on American soil by an invading army. 2 days later, on May 13th, the United States declared war on Mexico. There are three very specific points of view on these events. The first is the Mexican point of view. Mexico believed that by crossing the Nueces River, the United States Army had knowingly and willingly crossed the border into Mexico. They believed that they had every right to attack an invading force on Mexican soil. And, Mexico believed that the U.S. wanted territory that was not theirs. And Mexico believed they had the right to fight back. The second point of view is that of Americans who supported the idea of war with Mexico. Pro-war supporters in the U.S. believed that the Mexican army had crossed the Rio Grande, the border that had been legally established by both the Texas government and Santa Anna in 1836. And when the United States annexed Texas, that was now the border between Texas, the United States, and Mexico. So, looking at this, they believed that this U.S. Army patrol had been attacked by an invading force of Mexican soldiers. The third point of view is that held by those in the United States who were against war with Mexico. Anti-war protesters, and I call them that for lack of a better term, since they didn't really protest the way we think of protesters today, marching and carrying signs. They believed that President Polk had provoked Mexico into a fight to justify the United States declaring war on Mexico. They believed the ultimate goal of the U.S. was to take Mexican land and establish new U.S. territories in an effort to spread slavery westward. So there you have it. Three different points of view. I think today, with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, that we can say with some confidence that there's a lot of truth to the anti-war point of view. But by the same token, we can say the pro-war point of view has some validity to it as well, since the Mexican army did cross what is considered, at least in Texas and the United States, the legal border and ambush American troops. That leaves us with the Mexican point of view, which absolutely cannot be discounted because we know the United States was looking to expand its borders, and it just so happened that the thing standing between the United States and achieving manifest destiny was Mexico. So what it seems to all boil down to is which point of view you believe is true, and that's completely up to you, which, as it turns out, is pretty much how history is. It's very subjective and open to the interpretation of the individual. The facts are usually pretty clear, but the motivation behind the actions of key historical figures is oftentimes very murky. Well, that's it for the first Texas Hillstory podcast. My goal is to do a couple of these each month. I hope you liked what you heard, and I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for upcoming episodes, please feel free to contact me. My email address is cam.hill@att.net, or look up our page on Facebook at Texas Hillstory Podcast. Until next time.